The U.S. banking sector is showing fresh signs of fragility. It's been a few months since we saw 3 of the 4 largest bank failures in U.S. history. In March, SVB and Signature banks collapsed, and then in May, First Republic failed. For the federal government overseeing the offloading of its assets to J.P. Morgan Chase. Since then, the Fed continued to put stress on the system, hiking rates another 2 times. And now more cracks are emerging. Moody's recently cut the credit ratings of 10 mid-sized and small U.S. banks and also put some of the nation's biggest lenders, like Bank of New York Mellon and State Street, on review for potential downgrades. And now analysts from Fitch Ratings are warning that a number of big banks, even J.P. Morgan, could be downgraded after Fitch cut its assessment of the banking industry's overall health in June. Now, the fact that Fitch lowered the score of the U.S. banking industry, so-called operating environment, to AA- from AA, went largely unnoticed. But now Fitch is saying that if this gets downgraded 1 notch lower to A+, the rating agency will have to issue downgrades of more than 70 U.S. banks. And also getting very little coverage as the marriage of necessity between Park West Bank and Bank of California, with a merger of the two that will create a bank with $36 billion in assets. Meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, we have the messy UBS takeover of Credit Suisse, which was orchestrated by Swiss authorities. But now UBS is facing a growing number of legal challenges to that controversial takeover. Well, there is a real danger that should the banking crisis worsen, there could be new regulation that would prevent people from withdrawing their money. That he could see the Federal Reserve or U.S. Treasury implementing a lock-in period and restricting depositors from pulling money out of their banks. Now, he has cautioned that history has shown us that dire times can lead to extreme measures, citing the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, when gold was confiscated and private ownership is illegal. Will the U.S. banking dollars will be crashed? Peter Schiff believes that while the U.S. is currently not experiencing a full-blown crisis due to its creditors still maintaining confidence in its purchasing power, it is only a matter of time before these crises come to fruition. The raising of the debt ceiling and ongoing reliance on borrowing money without adequate spending cuts are major concerns.
We spent months threatening default, basically letting our creditors know that we may in fact default, and that they were low men on the totem pole. Because during these discussions of raising the debt ceiling, nobody said we're going to prioritize bondholders. They basically said if we can't borrow more money, the first thing we're going to do is default on the money we've already borrowed. And so that is an official admission that the U.S. Treasury is running nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. We're only going to pay back the money we've already borrowed if we can find new people to lend us more, right? We're not going to just tax people to make good on these commitments. We're going to rely 100% on new borrowers. And so that is the pure definition of a Ponzi scheme. The only difference is it's being run by the government instead of a private citizen, but it's still not going to work, right? Ponzi schemes can't work by definition. But then the other problem with this is the rationale, right, or the pretense for the debt ceiling increase was that America always pays its bills, and we need to raise the debt ceiling so we can keep paying our bills. Well, it's actually the opposite. The reason we have to raise the debt ceiling is because we never pay our bills.
During discussions about raising the debt ceiling, little consideration was given to prioritizing bondholders over other forms of expenditure. This lack of priority sends alarm bells ringing regarding America's ability to fulfill financial obligations. It reveals that the U.S. Treasury is running nothing more than a Ponzi scheme.
Well, obviously, when you're running $2 trillion a year deficits, which the U.S. is, you've got to make that up. You've either got to cut spending or raise taxes. Now, personally, I would like to see everything through spending cuts. But to the extent that we need additional taxes, it should be through a consumption-based tax, at least in the United States, not higher income taxes, but some type of value-added tax, sales tax, or something like that, that isn't as economically destructive as taxing work and production. You want to tax consumption. But we really need significant across-the-board spending cuts, and not just fraud, waste, and abuse. We need to actually cut real spending now, immediately and significantly, including things that are off the table, like Social Security, Medicare, government pensions. We have to cut defense spending. And there are a lot of agencies and departments that I think can be completely eliminated. A lot of spending can be cut Because if we don't do that, there is no way that we can handle this debt. In fact, even if we do that, I still don't think we can handle it without a restructuring of the debt, which means that we have to tell our creditors honestly that, we owe $32 trillion. We cannot pay it back. The taxpayer just simply doesn't have the resources to make good on these commitments. So we need a restructuring here. We're not going to give you 100 cents on the dollar, maybe 50 cents on the dollar. I don't know what the number is.
Okay.
But owners of U.S. Treasuries around the world need to experience some pain along with everybody else, because I don't think the American voters are going to put up with the government saying, you're not going to get the Social Security benefits we promised you, but the Chinese are going to get 100% of what we promised them on their treasuries. I think everybody is going to have to take a haircut to avoid a crew cut, and that would be inflation. Because once you recognize that the debt is unpayable, the only question is how do we default on it or restructure it. We can do it honestly, the way I would like to do it, which would actually be better for everybody. Or we could just print money until the money has no value and we have runaway inflation, in which case our creditors will actually be worse off. I would rather get back 50 cents on the dollar, but have the dollar maintain its value, than get back all my dollars, but have them lose 90% of their purchasing power or more.
By relying solely on new borrowers rather than taxing citizens or making meaningful spending cuts. Schiff argues that this unsustainable approach will eventually shatter investor confidence. To address these issues and avoid hyperinflation down the line, Schiff suggests implementing significant across-the-board spending cuts alongside reforms.
Well, if we stay on this road, then hyperinflation is a foregone conclusion. It is an absolute certainty. So the only way to avoid hyperinflation is to get off the road. But the question is, when do we turn off? How long do we wait before we change course?
Like hyperinflation of Argentina and other countries around the world, that means something to those citizens. But hyperinflation, the US dollar, well, that's global.
Oh, yeah.
What does that look like?
I don't know. We've never seen it, right?
Yeah,
we haven't had hyperinflation in a reserve currency, like the U.S. But I do think that the most pain will be felt in America, right? Because Americans have benefited dramatically from the dollar status, because it allows Americans, of course I'm an American, but it allows us to live beyond our means, because we don't have to produce to consume. We can just produce money, which costs nothing, and we just create out of thin air. And we can exchange that paper money for the real goods that are produced by hardworking people around the world in factories, and those goods, aren't created out of thin air. They take real resources, land, labor, capital, things like that. And those resources could have been used for something else. Instead, they were used to produce stuff for Americans. So we get a benefit. We also get to borrow money cheaper because we get to borrow what everybody else saves. Americans don't save anything. So where does the credit come from? It comes from the rest of the world. So when the dollar crashes, that's actually going to be a net positive outside the United States, particularly the emerging markets, because I think the people there have borne the lion's share of the burden of propping up the U.S. economy. So I think they have the most to gain from the crash of the dollar. But of course, there are people all around the world that own a lot of dollars, and so to the extent that they're overexposed to the dollar, they're going to experience some losses. So just like when we had the financial crisis, it wasn't confined to the United States, because people in Sweden, for example, owned mortgage-backed securities from the United States. So, we've spread the bad paper all around the world. So it's going to be felt all around the world. But I think on balance, it's going to be a positive outside the United States, but a huge negative, at least in the short term, for the United States.
That brings us to the combination of restructuring the debt, going to international bondholders of U.S. Treasuries and saying to them, we're going to have to restructure this. You're going to have to take a hit. Internally, you're going to have to take a hit. If this doesn't happen, we could see hyperinflation. But then let's bring in what happens with gold, what happens with stores of value in this environment, in this macroeconomic environment.
Well, I think no matter what, gold's going up. I mean, obviously, under hyperinflation, that's when it goes up the most.
Yeah. And
I hope that we avoid that. I mean, I own a lot of gold and gold stocks, so I would personally benefit as an investor from that. But I don't want that to happen. I would prefer an alternative course. But even devaluation default, I think, is going to be bullish for gold. Because I think gold is going to emerge either way as the preeminent store of value safe haven. And I think that the dollar's status as the reserve currency is going to be lost.
Okay.
And then the question is, what is going to replace it? And a lot of people think that the dollar status is not at jeopardy because they don't see a viable alternative, but they're looking in the wrong place. They're looking at, sterling, or they're looking at the euro, or they're looking at the yen or the RMB, and they're saying, hey, those currencies aren't ready to be the reserve. And I would agree.
Right.
We don't need another fiat currency to act as a reserve. We need real money. We need gold. Gold was the reserve for all currencies prior to Bretton Woods. And even after Bretton Woods, when the dollar was the reserve, it was only a reserve because it was backed and redeemable in gold. In fact, the dollar was defined as a weight in gold. That's why it was considered as good as gold. So we've really only been on a fiat standard since 1971. So, about 50 years, a little bit more.
That was only meant to be temporary, Nixon's gold shock.
Oh, initially, sure.
Okay,
sure.
so it still could be temporary, only it lasted years.
Yes. Well, if we were to go back on the gold standard, the question is, would the world trust us?
Right.
Because we already screwed them over once. In fact, when we talked about the debt ceiling, and everybody said America has never defaulted on its commitments, that was a lie, because Federal Reserve notes were obligations to pay gold. And up until 1971, if you were in Britain and you had $35, you could get an ounce of gold. That was the commitment that we made to the world. And then we defaulted on that, and we gave them nothing. It wasn't just that we gave them 50 cents on the dollar, right? Or we didn't say, okay, we'll give you half an ounce of gold for your $35. We'll give you no gold. It was a complete default. So I don't think any one country should be able to issue a reserve. I think that the real reserve should be gold. And we should all be on a level playing field. If you want gold, you have to earn it. So either you have to mine it, or you have to produce something that you could trade for the gold that somebody else mined. But we need an honest monetary system that keeps governments in check. Because if we had sound money, we wouldn't have all this inflation. We wouldn't have all these budget deficits, because they're not possible under a sound monetary system.
So are you suggesting multiple gold-backed currencies across the world?
They should all be gold-backed.
It becomes increasingly crucial for policymakers worldwide to consider alternatives such as spending cuts and taxation reforms alongside addressing global reliance on fiat currencies alone. Peter Schiff's suggestion of returning to sound money principles tied directly with tangible assets like gold provides stability while holding governments accountable.